Well, it's a remarkable story, actually, I must confess, because I was lucky enough to have two very musical parents. My father taught the cello, and he also conducted a local orchestra called the Southend Philharmonic. And he'd actually taken one lesson from Sir Henry Wood, who invented the promenade concerts. And Sir Henry said, "You'll never be a great conductor, but you'll be able to tell the musicians what to do and they'll do it for you." So I think my father must have been quite a charmer. My mother played very respectable ragtime piano, rather. And so it was a musical background even when I was a little tiny boy. I remember under the door of my bedroom, they would have Delius playing. My father was a big fan of the composer Delius. And I actually did an album a lot later on of Delius's music. But I think the first thing I ever got involved in was actually the drums, because I saw a Fred Astaire film when I think I was 6, 7, called Daddy Longlegs. And the movie starts with Fred playing on this enormous drum kit before going into his dance. And I was enthralled by the thought of being a drummer and the sight of the drum kit. So I couldn't afford to buy a drum kit, of course, because we were not rich at all as a family. So I built my own. And I had a tin drum, which I'd had since I was probably 1 or 2, as a tom-tom. I had a tambourine for a snare drum, a big old military drum that I'd found for 10 shillings in a junk shop as a tom-tom, bass tom-tom, and 2 tiny little, what we call choke cymbals to make up the kit. And I used to bang along to 78s, which I'd acquired when I was a very little boy. 78 recordings, for anybody who doesn't remember them at all, the 2 sides which revolved at 78 RPM, revolutions per minute. And I used to play the records. And I think the big change came when I finally got to high school, Southend High School in 1957, where they had the infinite blessing of free instruments. So the first class I passed was the violin class, which I joined immediately because I got a free violin. And after that, I realized that the violin was not really very jazz-friendly, unless you were Joe Venuti or Stefano Capelli. So I moved on to clarinet, which was a lot more jazz-friendly. I was impressed by lots of jazz clarinet players, Benny Goodman, Artie Shaw, and lots of others. And there were lots of clarinetists to copy. So I had lessons on the clarinet, but all the while I had this secret, I have to say, it was like a lust for the trumpet. And when I was, I think, 10 years old, there was a very lovely old junk shop in Southend-on-Sea in the market. And they had an E-flat alto horn, which cost, I think, about £3.10, £3.50 nowadays. And I said to my parents, I really, really want that. And they got it for me for Christmas. And my mother said, "You're not supposed to see it before Christmas, but I'll let you have a look every day." So I bought a music book on how to use valves. So by Christmas Day, I could actually play the alto horn fairly well. And then a year or 2 later, of course I wanted a trumpet more than anything else, but I'd already got a violin and a clarinet. And my father was starting to say, "Where's this going to stop?" So I was in the pub one day in the Plough and Sale at Paglesham, where we lived at the time. And a man called Fred Walker said, "I've got a trumpet under the bed." I said, "Oh, wow." So I said to my mother, "Can you ask him if I could borrow it, please?" And I was in a fever of excitement because by this time I'd already got used to jazz, fallen in love with jazz by the time I was 6. And this was going to be the instrument that was going to be the instrument for my life. So I spent the whole week in a fever of excitement. And on Sunday morning, when my parents went to the pub, I said, "Do you think I could phone Mr. Walker and see if he's actually bought the trumpet for me to try?" And he had. So I'll never forget that great moment. I was outside the pub, being underage, of course, and on the bench was the trumpet case, and I remember the first time I opened it and saw this beautiful thing. And that's how I fell in love with the trumpet. But unlike the other instruments, I didn't take lessons. I thought it would be nice as a kind of a legal sideline. So I learned how to play the trumpet quite quickly, but combined that with clarinet, alto saxophone, which I also had, lost the violin very early, and played in local jazz clubs. And that took me to the age of 19, when all of a sudden I'd had a year off because I'd acquired a very beautiful girlfriend who I still know, a nice friend, and courting got in the way for a little bit. But one day when I was 19, I went into the music room in our house, picked up the trumpet, and all of a sudden this extraordinary, beautiful noise that I never got before suddenly came out. And what had happened was that my embouchure, that's what we call the places we play, had set. So from that day onwards, I was a trumpet player only. And I had lessons from a wonderful man called Bert Collier, who lived in Hockley, nearby. And Bert had played with a lot of the great dance bands, like Joe Loss before the war. He was a fine teacher. So he's the one who started me on my serious career to trumpet in 1965. After 1965, my parents were absolutely sure, I'd left school in 64, that I should get a job. And of course that wasn't music, because in those days if you went to what we called a careers convention and mentioned that you want to be a musician, they wouldn't have the slightest idea what to tell you, especially if you wanted to be a jazz musician. So in 1966 I joined the library in Southend. I had a very brief period as a solicitor's clerk, which didn't last any time at all. But in 65, I joined the library in Southend, the public library. And I worked there, and I went to Ealing to get my library degree from 1966 to 68. And during that period, a local musician who I don't think really quite knew what he was about said, I noticed that when you play the trumpet, your embouchure is there. And every trumpet player I've ever seen plays from there. So I dutifully, for 4 years, tried to play from there and lost it all. So in 1970, I said, no, this won't do. I'm going to go back, even though I look funny, and play on the side. And that's what I did. And the move back was immediately sensational, though I must say myself. And I began to make a few noises around the area. I played with a local dance band, cum soul band, called the Mel Lewis Band for 4 years. And in 1970, I started seriously playing jazz at a pub called the Red Lion Margaretting, which is near Chelmsford. I didn't take any more lessons after that, although I continued to see my beloved teacher, Bert Collier, a lot. But basically, I just flew off. And in 1971, I suddenly realized I was playing with soul bands, free jazz bands with a man called Trevor Taylor, any gig I could get. And I suddenly thought, no, the music I play when I wake up in the morning is more likely to be Louis Armstrong, Bing Crosby, Red Nichols, what I would call I suppose you'd have to call it the traditional end of the music. So I started a band of my own in Essex called Digby's Half Dozen. And that was, I think really the great big act of good luck. We had a nice little band. I wrote the arrangements and good players. And I used to belabor the 100 Club, which was that London's home of traditional jazz, 100 Oxford Street, every Monday morning and say, please can we play at the 100 Club? And the owner didn't really know who on earth I was. But finally he very resignedly said, okay, Digby, I'll put you on July the 23rd. And I said, and this was the biggest question of all, who are we supporting? Well, by that time, for 2 or 3 years, I'd realized that a man called Alex Welsh had quite the best band in the country for the kind of music I liked. Every musician was of premier quality. Probably at that time I was in my middle 20s and they were in their middle 30s. And Roger Horton, the owner of the 100 Club, said, oh yes, Digby, you're supporting Alex Welsh. the great band that I wanted to support more than anything in the world. So up we went, played the opening set, and we had a good night. And Alex, who was a very sweet and dear man, came over and put his arms out and said, I think we've met before, which we had done. He said, I've never heard you play, but you're a good player and I'm going to help you all I can. So that immediately introduced me into this circle of players that I love more than anybody. And amongst many other gifts, Alex said to me one Friday, what are you doing tomorrow, lad? And I said, nothing, Alex. He said, yes, you are. You're guesting with me at the Royal Festival Hall. Capacity sold out audience, and your fellow guests will be blah, blah, blah. And so I played on my first West End stage in 1974, and in the same year Alex called me and said, would you like to make a record with my band? And I said, of course, but why? You're the leader. And he said, well, I'm under contract to another company called Black Lion, and I've had an offer from Rediffusion, so if you want, you can go and make an album with my band for the Rediffusion label, and we'll call it something else. So that was my first recording, I think. And then, well, by that time it sort of flowered. I was very lucky. I was a good player when I was young, I'll say it myself. And I got to know all the people that I most revered. Many of them your people wouldn't know now, but there were people like Dave Shepherd, who was Britain's Benny Goodman. There was Roy Williams, who was the best trombone player in the country. John Barnes, who was an outstanding saxophone and clarinet player. Alex, of course, his confreres, Fred Hunt, the piano player, Brian Lemon. These were like the Premier League players in their school. And I jumped right in and got to know them all. I also played with a wonderful band led by a bass player called Ron Russell, who isn't well known as such in terms of national fame, but he had a really great band with some of my all-time favorite players. So I joined them too in 1974. And by 1976, I was, well, coming into work in the library. I'd lost about 17 stone, and I had a nightclub tan, you know. And I thought, it's taken this long, but I'm ready to go pro. So I gave up the library on 1st of January 1977 and went on the road. And that's how I became a professional musician. And to be honest, I was 30 by then, quite late. And it took me a while to adjust, because you suddenly realize if you become a professional musician, you're in the no pay, no play syndrome. You know, if you don't play, you don't get paid. You don't get the annual increments that 9-to-5 people get. You don't get the sick pay that 9-to-5 people get. You're absolutely on your own. And that had quite an effect on me, actually. It gave me, I would say, looking back, something very close to a breakdown for at least a couple of years. And I went back to live in the country for a short time with my mother to adjust my mind to it all. And then went back and went on. Once I turned pro, I played with a huge variety of different people. Also, hugely different sorts of music, in very good company, but everything from ragtime to big bands. I did some session work with people who were getting to be famous, which involved reading, of course, reading music and going into the studio at 9 o'clock and being ready. And I think probably at that time, from about 1978, Alex Welsh, my hero, was becoming ill. And an agent gave me the opportunity to take over his band, which I emphatically turned down because I thought, this is not a friend, you know, this is not what you do to a friend. So at that time, there was a violinist, still is well famous, called Stefan Grappelli, who'd decided to work with a different group. So Stefan Grappelli's trio asked me if I would join them. So I went on the road with the band, which was called Velvet, not a very good name, but a good band of excellent players for 4 or 5 years. And that was fun. And I did a lot of guest solo spots as well around the country. But I did realize around about 1983 that I was doing what everybody else wanted to do. Because if you work for a band leader, you are contracted musically and emotionally to play what they want to play. That happened a little bit with Velvet later, because we were on the road for 4 or 5 years, and it became a bit stale. So around about 1983, I thought, okay, I think I'll think now about doing the projects that I want to do. And the first one of those was a tribute to a veteran trumpeter called Nat Gonella, who was enormously famous before the war. He'd now retired, but I got some of his musicians together, including a great bass player called Tiny Winters and a fine tenor saxophone player called Pat Smuts, both of whom survived this far. And we went on the road with a show called We Remember Nat. So that was really my first solo project. And after that, I'd also embarked on jazz education, rather like Yolanda Charles. And so I worked from 1979 on sort of a rudimentary teaching jazz in schools project, which lasted for 10 years. And so I was doing all kinds of things, fellow guest spots, leading my band. By that time, the half dozen had disappeared, but these thoughts stayed in the back of my mind. After Alex Welsh died, sadly, at the age of only 52, in, I think, 1983, perhaps, we led the Alex Welsh Memorial Band. I did that for a while. But I was doing just about everything. The book was just a huge kind of block of blue ink with everything, you know, sometimes 2 or 3 times a day. But then came a very bad time in 87. I had been playing particularly well, but I had inadvertently acquired a bad habit of misplaying the trumpet. And that was very serious, because one night we were playing a duo concert at one of my favorite venues in Southport, and all of a sudden there was a crashing pain down the side of my face, which over the next few weeks went to my head and down into my left chest. And what I'd done is I'd collapsed my diaphragm, which is what trumpet players use, and really destroyed my playing completely, which is very difficult. I mean, I couldn't play anything like I could before. So for the time being, I got 6 of my best friends, all very well-known names: Dave Shepard, Alan Ganley, Len Skeet, Brian Lemon, the tenor player Al Gay, and the great trombonist Roy Williams. And they'd all noticed, and I said, fellas, this is where we are, I'm sorry, but I'm going to write a book of arrangements where at least I can play the lead just about, and I'll rely on you super talents to make it sound good. And that was the band called Super Kings, and that lasted for 5 or 6 years, taking us into the early 90s. And by 1995, once again, things got a bit stale. You know, the Dixieland or the swing music, which I loved, didn't quite have the ring of joy that it had before, partly because of my own technical inability. But by the mid-1990s, I had actually recovered what we call an embouchure. I couldn't play like I did before, but I could play well enough. So in 1995, I thought, for various reasons, some of them to do with a small amount of disillusion, it's time to form your own band again. So I reformed Digby's Half Dozen, and we did quite a lot of different music. We did multi-vocals, because I'm very fond of close harmony, and we enjoyed that. We played some bebop, we played some Dixieland, we played a little bit of R&B. And I think, actually, although the band is still together, there was a certain problem with that, because jazz people, generally speaking, like to know you're doing one thing, you know, and I was doing lots of different things with my very talented group. And I don't know that sometimes that didn't confuse the issue. I like it a little bit to Manhattan Transfer, who I admire enormously. They've, I think, just retired. But they were a superb vocal group. They did everything from doo-wop to R&B to vocalese, which is putting words to great jazz solos. And in a way, I think they split their audience a bit, because the people who came along to hear The Boy from New York City, a great rock and roll number, didn't particularly want to hear a vocalized version of Clifford Brown's solo from I'll Remember April. So there was a problem there, but nonetheless we were successful. And over the next 20 years, we did win the British Jazz Award for top small group 12 times. And that wasn't bad. I don't pretend to claim for a moment that we were the top group in small group in jazz. Of course not. Of course we weren't. All kinds of other things had come along, some of them better, some perhaps not quite so good. But it was basically a very pleasant award to receive from some extremely nice people. And that lasted, along with guest spots and other things as well, you know, until COVID, I suppose. And COVID brought everything to a halt for 2 years. And since then, well, I've been tootling along, which will bring us along to why we're here today at the Jazz Centre. Because over the years, I should probably mention briefly for reference that I did 12 years with the BBC, presenting jazz programs like Jazz Parade and Jazz Notes. That was from 1986 to 1998, and I worked for Radio 2, Radio 3, Jazz FM, BBC World Service, and why not British Forces Broadcasting, yes. So I had 12 years of doing broadcasting, and also enjoyed writing books. So over the years I did a number of books, one of which was the first ever basically European produced jazz encyclopedia, which allowed me and two other very, very good writers, Brian Priestley and Ian Carr, the late Ian Carr, to celebrate British musicians. And that book sold very well, and I'm pleased about that. That was nice. Glad to know. So there was writing, there was journalism and articles, there was broadcasting. And the broadcasting very fortuitously came along in 1986, which was 1 year before I had the collapse of my embouchure, when I couldn't really play very well. I muddled through. But the broadcasting lasted from 86 to 98, by which time I could play again. So I had an extremely fortunate career, really. And what with that and the teaching, on a slightly different subject, if you don't mind my carrying on, there were two things which I think are fairly significant about the jazz scene. One was a story that a lot of people know about the Jazz Centre Society, which flourished in London in the late 70s through the middle 80s. And one of their primary aims was to establish a cultural centre for jazz in this country, something we'd never had. And when you think that the Beatles came along in 1963, and this was due to open in 1986, we needed a cultural centre because our art form was getting woofed into the background, obviously by the groups, you know, the whole rock and roll culture that we live in now. And jazz was unfortunate. It was somewhere between an art form and somewhere between a lapsed popular music. It didn't have a place in society. So we needed a jazz centre. But I won't mention names, but let's just say that in 1986, the £3 million of public funding that had been given for this project mysteriously disappeared. Nobody was ever brought to court. Nobody was sensible enough to ask serious questions or get a lawyer. And consequently, in 1986, in came the receivers and the accountants, and the £3 million plus of funding had gone. So I was actually extremely angry about that, because I'd been a professional musician for the best part of 10 years, and I knew what a cottage industry it is. So they'd invited me in at one point to advise on a library provision within this new cultural centre that was coming to be in 1986. And I looked around the table and I thought, I don't know. I saw rather a lot of bottles of wine and rather a lot of what I would call rather jokey atmosphere. And being an ex-librarian, of course, I took this very seriously, because our culture is embedded very largely in books. And my personal belief in 2025 is that it still is. I look at Wikipedia, because I still write liner notes for albums and things. And Wikipedia is not the answer to books. It's an adjunct to books. And I think when people have got used to online information, they'll realise how important books still are. So in short, in 1987, I thought, well, if there's not going to be a library at the Jazz Centre because it's flopped, I'm going to start one, and I'm going to get my old library friends to help me, which they did. They gave me an office in Loughton Central Library and said, you go in there and play if you want to. I'd not play the trumpet, play with the idea. And the National Jazz Archive opened in 1988, which is our National Research Centre for Jazz. And I'm really pleased about that. You know, it's still going strong in 2025, although there was some small threats about accommodation. But it's been there a long time, and I'm glad to say that much more intelligent people than me use it to write books or to research for films or documentaries, and it's well established. It still has a ways to go, but after, 1988 to 2025, that's got to be 37 years, I guess. Am I right? Yeah, about 30, getting on for 40 years. And I was very pleased. But having said that, I realised that although there was a library provision in Loughton for proper, decent research of our craft, we had never, ever thought about the social aspect of a cultural centre for jazz. A research centre, yes. A cultural centre, no. So I got in touch with some old friends of mine down here in Southend-on-Sea. And once again, they gave me a room and said, go ahead and play, enjoy yourself, muck around. And around about the same time, slightly briefly, we had received two very important artifacts. One was the first piano of the late Sir John Dankworth, who was our first jazz knight, and who had done immeasurable services to jazz over the years as a band leader, composer, film composer, everything. John was one of the kings of British jazz, one of the great men, and also one of the nicest men I knew. And of course his wife was the great Dame Cleo Lane, who was similarly a friend and had supported the National Jazz Archive in Loughton from the day it opened, selflessly. They'd come down any time, talk, sing, perform, all for nothing. They were a king and queen of our music. Anyway, in 2014, I got together with a few pals and we talked about the idea of restoring a cultural centre, not a research centre, a cultural centre for jazz, where you could watch films, read books, enjoy talking about the music, take part or listen to record recitals, have live jazz, do all the things that the original centre was meant to do. So we started off in the room here, which you can probably see a little bit of. And in there we had Sir John Dankworth's first piano, and we had the complete collections of the trumpet player Humphrey Lyttelton, who was famous from 1948 as a band leader, later as a broadcaster for 4 decades, a prolific author about the music, and in many ways I think he was, although he wasn't always, shall we say, a household name, most people knew the name of Humphrey Lyttelton and what he'd achieved. And he ended up actually being the MC for a very funny panel show called I'm Sorry I Haven't a Clue, which is on the BBC for years and years and years. So we had Hump's desk, and we had his trumpets, and we had his correspondence, turning down a knighthood, turning down a CBE because he didn't want them. And I said to the National Jazz Archive, couldn't these go to you? And they said, no, because we now have so much printed material, we haven't got room. So we don't collect what I suppose you could call artifacts. Well, as the years went on, I acquired Louis Armstrong's original trumpet. I had a dream about having a timeline of jazz in Britain and America from the 1910s to the 2020s, which we've achieved. And in recent years, although we started off as a likable local amateur effort, we've been very lucky to achieve some powerful people on our board. We had one or two people who contributed very generously to us in the early days. But later on, in addition to those lovely people, almost all of whom are still with me, we had Yolanda Charles, MBE, who is a very influential performer in the more contemporary jazz funk acid area of the music. And she was kind enough to say, I'd like to join our board. So I was thrilled to get Yolanda because she is very public spirited. When on one occasion we were talking and she said, I've got an MBE and I don't know why. So I think I should give something back to British jazz. Then we acquired a very brilliant chairman, a young man, because some of us are getting on a bit, called Matthew Fisher, who began by designing our website brilliantly, but has now become our chairman. And he is a brilliant young man, 30 years old. We have Karen Pearson, who runs Folded Wing on our board. Folded Wing is a company that produces the Jamie Cullum show and the Soweto Kinch show on Radio 2. So she's a powerful woman with a huge degree of experience in producing jazz programs. She's also worked with Giles Peterson for years, who's a very big name in the acid jazz area. So our board has expanded enormously, and we've begun to make, thanks to my chairman and my team, inroads into the national scene. So this year, 2025, we have an exhibition to tie in with the London Jazz Festival, and the Guildhall School of Music are taking a permanent exhibition of what we do. And the Pizza Express chain have also aligned with us for various reasons, too long to go into now, but in connection with our collections. So we're beginning to make inroads on the national scene. And I do hope that one day we will be recognized seriously as a cultural center for jazz. Mainly because, for me, jazz is still a cottage industry. It gets very little in the way of media representation, a little more recently, but still very limited. And public finance is disgraceful. We share 4% of Arts Council funding with brass band music and one other group, which I forget about. But we get about, I would say, 1% of public funding per year, which is disgraceful. The jazz world has to do something about that. But we need people to lobby for the craft and to make themselves publicly heard. And that's a long climb up for being a local charity. And I'm fortunate again in that our chairman, Matthew Fisher, is very good at setting up national/international relationships with other people doing the same thing. And I don't know if I'll be alive to see it, but I think probably, because I'm 80, but next 10 years, I would expect to see this organization doing quite a lot to bring jazz forward and the public perception of the music. Be represented a lot more on the radio, on TV. It would be nice if somebody could make a film about jazz that isn't determinedly pessimistic about the music. although I like Round Midnight by Bertrand Tavernier, a French producer, I like it very much. It's a great, great film. But like so many other films, it ends up in death and tragedy. And that is not the way I'm built. I like to think about music in an optimistic way and believe to some degree in the ability to get to grips with the problems that the scene faces. So I suppose in that regard I remain hopeful, even though for the last 50 years I've been involved in what I can only describe as a cottage industry, where I might, if I'm very lucky, be asked to play somewhere for £200, whereas, well, in the pop scene, we know it's an entirely different scene, and it has been since the 60s, you know, but most of the groups I know are gasping for work because there are so many aspirant performers. The market is very limited. And I think in conclusion, really, I feel fortunate in that being a baby boomer born in 1946, I was 17 when the Beatles came along, so I could have gone down the road of that culture, which is now predominant in our society, because we do live in a rock-based culture. Our icons are Elton John, Mick Jagger, the Beatles, of course, and a lot of other people as well. But I don't see many icons in the jazz world. I'd like to see a few more. I'd like to see, here's an example, Alan Skidmore, who's been a prolific contributor to our culture for the best part of 60 years. I don't see why he hasn't even had an MBE. I want to make quite sure that in the future more visionary musicians are recognized in the way that, fortunately, Yolanda has. And that's what I would like to see. I'd like to see our music happier, more flourishing, more wealthy, more competitive, more of an ambience in which there is a wish to contribute because there's something at the other end of it, rather than a 10-line review in one magazine. I'd like to see a situation where if a major performer like Alan Barnes or Yolanda get TV, they get TV performances, their status is fully realized, and I've seen a whole 60 years of people not getting that. So I suppose in the end, that's what I hope the National Jazz Centre, you know, the Jazz Centre UK as we call it, very optimistically, I hope that'll be what we do in the end.